Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of 3D modeling, unwrapping and texturing the Stylized Dragonbird drone in 3ds Max 2024, Rhythm and Substance Painter. Let's get started. Modeling this entire guy took me about 6 hours, mainly because I didn't have a reference image and experimented a bit with the turbines and wings. Of course, using a reference, or at least a basic blockout, would have been much more efficient. I've sped this up 5x, some viewers mentioned that 7x was too fast. Let me know in the comments if this format works better for you. As always, if you are a beginner and would like to follow along, set the playback speed to 0.25x and mute the sound. Finally, I wanted to mention that I won't be narrating the entire video. I'll definitely comment on all crucial details though. I'll be leaving you now and then. If my narration stops at some point, it will definitely resume later, in the next part. The video is divided into chapters with timestamps available in both the description and the comments below. You'll also find a link to view the 3D model on Sketchfab. Now let me say a few words about the software I use. First one is 3ds Max 2024. I really enjoy using the loop regularizer script. You can also use rapid tools. In this process, I only rely on the loop regularizer to work with various circle orifices. Also, I use the weighted normals modifier. Next one is Rhythm. It's a paid software, which is however free for students and teachers. I really like its straightening algorithm, and also its tool that allows you to group and stack similar UVs. Obviously, you can use free software like Blender to achieve similar results. Finally, there's Substance Painter. For this particular video, I have used a single free smart material I took from Fred Taylor's ArtStation page. His YouTube channel is named Stylized Craft. Anyways, let's get to modeling. Just as with my other models, I skip high to low poly baking workflow entirely. My final model has something around 16k polygons, which could have been reduced further with a single pass of manual retopology, or used as is in some indie project. Obviously we get a lot of unnecessary polygons here, from our dragon's horns and wings and other cylindrical elements. For example, each horn has around 16 sides, while 9 to 12 would be enough. Same goes for wheels and landing gear stands. The dragon, the turbine and the rocket nozzle are merged into a single object. Normally I prefer to model everything but moving parts as single objects. Basically, I only separate wheels and their supports from the main model, as well as the rotating propeller that is positioned inside the main turbine. If you want to make the bird more creepy and semi-realistic, you may want to add glass lenses before the lamps in its eyes. I started modeling from a simple 7-sided cylinder by using the NURMS process with its iteration count set to 2. Why 7? Well, I wanted its first row to have 3 openings, 2 for horns and 1 for neck, so I have added at least 2 openings to separate them from each other. It's essential to rotate your initial cylinder the way that one of its sides is turned to the axis that will host your turbine. This way you will be able to use word coordinates to work with your model. The second row features 2 openings mirroring the first. Both rows include a larger opening that will connect to the creature's beak, created using the Inset tool. Finally, a third row was added below the first to properly balance the head's connection to the neck at its midpoint. For beginners in 3ds Max, after enabling NURMS, you can inset or extrude surfaces by holding Shift while scaling them down or pulling them outward. Remember to switch to local coordinate systems for more precise control during these operations. As I've mentioned earlier, I set my NURMS iteration count to 2. This means our circular openings will mostly have 16 sides, which is fine for huge cylinders, but definitely excessive for horns and eyestalks. To optimize geometry, we can reduce poly count by collapsing edges on flat surfaces. This maintains shading quality while creating some triangles. While triangles aren't inheritably problematic, it's recommended to maintain quads when creating load variants for better topology control. We won't be using loads at all here. Some decorative elements may intersect the dragon's head without proper connections, though I prefer to avoid this unless necessary. Even though I don't have a reference image, I still follow some pre-planning. First I create a head base with openings, without knowing exactly how the horns will look yet. Then I add horns strategically, making sure they don't interfere with the turbine behind the head. Remember, the more you bend your horns, the higher their poly count becomes, requiring more supporting edge loops. Conversely, straight horns maintain a lower poly count. Before adding horns and beak, I converted the NURMS head to an editable poly and ran the loop regularizer on all openings. I bisect the model to work on just one half, then mirror it using the symmetry tool. The final step involves manually trimming down the poly count, though this can be skipped if you are planning to do manual retopology later. Finalize all head modifications while still in NURMS mode before converting to editable poly. This includes shaping adjustments and adding any necessary openings. Once converted, these changes become significantly more difficult to implement. The beak is created as a loft object. I give it the amount of sides, which is equal to the amount of sides of the beak's opening on the head. The loft is controlled by the spline you create, and also its scale setting found in the deformations menu. I set all of the spline's vertices to smooth, and then play around with the loft's scale. Remember, the beak doesn't have to be completely symmetrical. Also, it may be easier to edit its final shape when your loft is already up, so you see both its curve and also its final shape. The more curves your beak has, the higher its poly count will be. This isn't the place to trim down supporting edges, for the beak will be the pride of our model basically. Its tip doesn't have to be sharp, for it will be barely noticeable with a single chamfer we add to it. When merging the beak to the head, I stick to smooth intersections. In order to create them, I give the intersection edge 2 chamfers, 3 edges instead of 1 that is already there. The same technique applies to horn creation. For added realism, consider breaking symmetry at this stage. Subtle variations between the left and right horns can elevate your model's natural appearance. In my view, a truly well-crafted model should showcase its narrative through at least 6 distinct viewing angles. While I appreciate this standard, I haven't yet achieved this level of execution in my own work. At this stage, you can refine your model using an FFD modifier. However, avoid deforming surfaces containing triangles, as this may cause shading artifacts. To flatten these areas, select the problematic faces and uniformly scale them along the local axis perpendicular to their surface plane. Since most openings in the dragon's head are circular, we can optimize them by flattening the geometry, strategically collapsing edge loops into triangles, and regularizing the topology. This approach could have reduced my poly count by nearly 1k polys, especially useful given that 16-sided cylinders for eyestalks and horns are unnecessarily dense. I skipped this step in my workflow, but it's a valuable technique for efficient modeling. The snail-like eyestalks are created as loft objects. Consider breaking symmetry at this stage. Eyestalks can follow slightly different paths, and eyes themselves may vary in size. After all, this is a stylized cartoon model, where such imperfections add character. I create eyestalks the same way I've modeled horns and the beak. I create a circle with the amount of sides equal to the amount of sides of its base surroundings. Next I create a spline and use the loft modifier. Remember to not make eyestalks too curved. This will eat up a lot of polygons. Also, these things are quite thin, so 12 sides would be their cap if we approach this properly. The lamp eyes are made from spheres that have the same amount of sides as their holders and corresponding orifices in the bird's head. You can bevel them out of flat circles and chamfer them, or create them from pre-made spheres using the FFD modifier to flatten these spheres into some forms you like. As I've mentioned earlier, you can add some almost transparent dirty glass before your lamps to make your dragon's eyes more creepy and semi-realistic. If you do so, make sure to create them as separate objects and give them a different material. Finally, you have a choice to leave the connection edges hard or make them smooth. I stick to smooth connections for this model. Don't give your lamps too much unnecessary geometry. I don't think someone will be watching them up close. Also, you may give the lights themselves and their surroundings slightly more texture space to compensate for some absent topology. In order to position lamps perpendicular to their holders, I use the Select and Place tool while having vertex snapping enabled. I also set the lamp's pivot point to the center of its bottom part. I use the Insert Edge tool while holding the Shift key to add some extra supporting edge loops to the Eyestalks. Using the Shift key here forces 3ds Max to respect the existing edge flow. Once again, I simply duplicate the eye and its eyestalk to the opposite side of the model. You may choose to break symmetry here. Head pipes combine lofts and symmetry tool. The best way to split them into doubles is to combine the symmetry tool and rotate the mirror while having the edge constraint enabled. I use the FFD tool to break the symmetry later on. In order to give them some volume and thickness, I detach their tips from the rest of the model, apply a shell modifier, cut down their lower circle of polygons and create a cap for each pipe. Don't make them too deep, however, as we can simply paint their caps dark. These guys are pretty thin, so you don't have to waste too many polygons on them. In order to highlight pipes' openings, I give each of them a single chamfer. After using the symmetry tool, make sure it didn't generate some weird geometry or angles. You can do this manually, or select polygons that have over 4 edges in the selection menu on top of your screen. Make sure to trim down the poly count whenever possible. Thin geometry like these pipes may have as little as 8 sides without damaging the model. I mean, 16K polys is fine for many indie projects, but some mobile games require much better optimization. Once again, I use the FFD modifier to bend them slightly and break their symmetry. I give most intersections 2 chamfers, technically 3 edges instead of 1. You can obviously bake chamfers if you use high to low poly baking workflow, which I don't use here, or you can paint chamfers if you have some texturing skills, which is generally much better than what I do. Keeping surfaces smooth gives you more margin for error. It's much harder to make noticeable mistakes this way. Finally, I collapse the next opening and center the head's pivot point to it, in order to align it to the turbine itself once the turbine is there. It will also be the rotation axis for our dragon. The narration will resume in the next chapter of this video. The turbine starts as a basic cylinder. Using cylindrical boolean cutters of varying radii, I carve holes for the spines, then create a custom cutter for the wing geometry. Though I didn't fully block out the wing, I pre-planned its angle. Finally, I added 3 shallow openings for landing gear supports. These are non-functional and designed to simply intersect with gear objects during potential animation. I use 3 iterations of NURMS for the initial turbine's cube. We don't have to think of it, because for this part we will rely on automated retopology. In order to position spine openings properly, I create an edge loop from the top edge of our turbine and position my cylinder cutters along it. I finalize object positioning by switching between world and local coordinate systems. Just like before, I only work with one side of the turbine, as it will get mirrored after I'm satisfied with the results of automated retopology. This process is highly destructive. Make sure to save your model before pro-booleening it, and also make sure to block out your landing gear in order to not to ruin something important. I play with auto retopology iteration count till it starts ruining smallest holes. They shall at least have 8 sides or more. I give each spinal hole 12 sides, a deliberate choice, not an automated retopology result. The number must be even to maintain symmetry, and 12 strikes the ideal balance between visual fidelity and poly count efficiency. This often requires manually adjusting the side count up or down to hit the target. After the auto retopology is complete, I encircle each opening with a proper loop of near square polygons and trim down the poly count wherever possible manually. I take a lot of time here, moving polygons and vertices manually while having the edge constraint function enabled. What we want to achieve here is to maintain consistent edge flow while also keeping our polygons as close to square shape as possible. For the internal part of the turbine, I shrink down several edge loops by collapsing them on a flat surface. The turbine's interior must match the dragon's neck poly count. Since these parts connect structurally, ensure the inner ring shares the same number of sides as the neck's opening. I want the bird to be intuitively light, so I give it a tricycle landing gear configuration with a single wheel in its frontal part. The narration will resume in the next part of the video. Each spine has 84 polygons. That's basically a minimal value that is needed to give them a proper curve. They are pretty essential for our model, so we don't want to shrink their poly count down. Their chamfers and central lines match 12-sided surroundings perfectly. Perhaps the chef's kiss would be to slightly bend these spines to different sides of our dragon, but I never did it. I regularized lower parts of each spine for them to match their circular surroundings naturally. Also make your spines big and thick enough to match our overall cartoony design. Once again, I enable vertex snapping and use the Select and Place tool to position my spines properly. Next, I move them away from the dragon ever so slightly while switching my coordinate system to local. Finally, I bridge them to corresponding orifices. Mind that for the Select and Place tool to work correctly, we shall set the pivot point of each spine to the center of its bottom part. Still, we may have to rotate them on some local axis in some cases. Once the spines are positioned properly and moved away from the dragon, I bridge them to corresponding orifices. Then I add some edge loops to the connectors, scale them down, and chamfer them to make connectors smooth. I enable edge constraints to move edges along the model, and disable constraints when I need to scale some edges down. Also, you may want to detach connectors from the rest of the model if you want to give them a couple of supporting edge loops with the Insert Edge Loop tool. Finally, I create the attachment point for the left wing. We don't have to think much about it, wings are symmetrical, so it will be duplicated to the other side of the bird once the wing is attached to it. I need something to balance a massive head at this point, so I add a visually heavy rear rocket nozzle. Initially, I have modeled it in the shape of a pepper, giving it 3 orifices for a proper tail. Later I thought that this makes our design way too eclectic, so I simply removed them. I kept this part of the video for its overall consistency. Now mind these weird tail connectors, we will get rid of them further on. The general practice of working with round orifices is as follows. I use the loop regularizer script on each of them, and later surround each hole with a circle of near square polygons. The narration will resume in the next part of the video. Wing spines are made the same way the head horns were. In order to position things properly, I use the Select and Place tool, having the vertex snapping enabled. The spines themselves are attached to a connector model using the NURMS modifier, the same way we have created the head, and also the same way I will be modeling the turbine fan. Setting the NURMS iteration count to 2 makes our spines have 16 sides. This number can be reduced by introducing trees or ignored, like I did. The amount of sides of the initial cylinder is really important here. Once it is created, we won't be able to edit it in a non-destructive fashion. You can approach this by blocking things out, using a reference and planning the amount of spines, or simply relying on your practice and intuition. The wings I've made have a massive poly count that can only be trimmed down by running a pass of manual retopology. The spines don't need more than 12 sides, obviously. The main tip here when making stylized models is to avoid adding some small parts and some elements that are way more detailed than the rest. Also, it's a nice idea to add some elements that look similar to the elements you have made previously. For example, my Dragonbird's wing spines match its head horns in many ways. Wing spine hubs are massive. We don't want to reduce their size, since we are going for that stylized cartoony aesthetic I've mentioned before. In fact, they shall match the style of the rest of the model. I make sure that my left wing hub has the same amount of side edges as the connector model on the left side of the bird. I trim down some excessive edges and use the bridge tool to merge them. Then I add some supporting edge loops to the bridge in order to fix its shading. I'll resume the narration in the next part of this video. I've added two tiny nozzles in the frontal part of the turbine. This is a terrible construction idea, because I want these engines to compensate for the absence of proper tail and wing flaps. Basically, if our Dragonbird wants to go up, it will activate them both simultaneously, and if it wants to go left or right, it will only activate the nozzle at the opposite side. Nozzles are thin, so giving them 12 sides may seem like an overkill. Still, it was convenient to do so, considering the surrounding geometry. I don't think they'll be looked at a lot. This is why they don't need to be deep, and also they don't need too many supporting edge loops. Also increase the size of each nozzle, and give each of their sides a single chamfer. I'll resume the narration in the next chapter of this video. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't satisfied with the rear nozzle's appearance, so I removed the tail flap mounting holes entirely. This required deleting the central geometry and carefully matching the poly count between the tail and frontal sections before bridging them together. I added strategic edge loops to maintain smooth curvature throughout the assembly. A word of advice, this isn't the place to optimize poly count. The nozzle's silhouette is too visually important. Those extra support edges will serve us well. I give each of my wheels 16 sides. I choose this number because 16 easily splits into 4 2-polygon gaps and 4 2-polygon supports. You can easily reduce this count to 12 and split wheels into 3 2-polygon gaps and 3 2-polygon supports. Wheels are definitely not something a player will look at, unless the thing flies above the camera or the player's head. We shall also consider the fact that once our landing gear is retracted, the wheels won't go inside our Dragonbird's hull, but will rather stick to its belly. Make sure to not make your landing gear too thin and delicate, it will badly affect our overall cartoony design. At some point, I'll lift the Dragonbird's nose up by 5 degrees. Make sure to memorize this number, for it will affect the angle of the turbine fan. The frontal landing gear support stand received 8 edges, which are pretty enough for a thin cylinder. Rear landing gear stands received 12 sides. Obviously, the number of their sides isn't affected by the surrounding geometry above, since they aren't attached to the bird's hull and simply intersect it for easier animation. The stands aren't attached to wheels, for wheels to rotate freely. I cap each stand and place their centers to their caps. This way we can easily retract them by moving them along the local axis. Their cavities are simply painted dark. I don't want to add some small details, so our landing gear supports simply sink into the hull on animation. I'll continue the narration in the next chapter of this video. The propeller and fan blades follow the same construction method we used for the helicopter rotors in the previous video, a 12-sided base with a single iteration NURBS smoothing. While this approach generates excess polygons, which could be reduced by simply intersecting the blades with the central cylinder without attaching anything together, I maintain them as a single mesh, purely out of personal preference for unified geometry. After I'm done modeling a single blade and attaching it to the corresponding rotor's surface, I copy it 11 times and rotate each of them by 30 degrees. Obviously we want to create our turbine fan as a separate element in order to animate its rotation at some point. Also, we don't want to make our propeller blades straight. These guys weigh a lot in terms of poly count, so they are slightly bent, which can be achieved by applying an FFD modifier or rotating their edge loops one by one. I'll continue narrating in the next chapter of the video. This part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous video that covered the process of modeling the helicopter. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I group my objects, parent them to the central hull, set its pivot point to the middle of its lowest part, and place the whole group to 000 scene coordinates. Then I use a selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angles. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure that there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's X-View tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. Once again, I've checked the fact that my objects intersect each other properly and don't share any planes or vertices. I've also reset its scale, rotation and X-form of most elements and set their pivot points manually, remembering their proper initial rotation angles. If you used mirroring or symmetry while modeling, it's especially important to reset the X-form of your model and make sure that there are no flipped normals remaining. Just make sure to save your file before resetting the X-form. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradation. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tends to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure that the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks in the shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling, chamfering these edges, and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons, but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 4K Reso UV map, primarily for demo purposes. I gave it a padding of 16, which is a bit low. A padding of 32 will erase the possibility of texture leaks. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rhythm, except for cones and curved parts. Make sure to straighten all pipes for obvious reasons. At some point we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix no matter what tricks you try. The main hotkeys I use for this workflow is C for cut, Alt-G for stack, Shift-Alt-G to stack overlapped, G for group and Ctrl-G to remove grouping. Finally, I repack everything I want to repack, make sure my materials are named properly and assigned, and finish working in 3ds Max. The final thing I do in Max is explode the model. I pull all elements of my Dragonbird to different sides, so that they don't affect each other when baking ambient occlusion. When baking my model in Substance Painter, I set the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs, set my subsampling to 16, and click the setting to use the low poly mesh as a high poly one. Since my object is exploded, I don't have to think if some elements affect each other's ambient occlusion. Also, I've disabled the ID section. My texturing here is pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly rely on some preset smart materials. As I've mentioned earlier, I also use a free FL Stylized Smart material made by Fred Taylor, which is available at his ArtStation page. First, I apply the Steel Scratch Smart material, lower its luminosity and slightly increase its roughness. At this point, you may play around with its styling. Also, it's essential to switch its projection method to triplanar. This will hide most visible UV seams. Remember to block out your colors first and only bring them together when you see a reference image, a pre-made color palette, or your model in general. This is much easier than trying to match colors one by one. I've removed some parts of the video where I pick colors. It took me long enough. It is also much easier to use dark and dim colors if you are a beginner than to properly pick bright ones. Next, I've added the rust layer, altered its styling and projection method, and then masked it with Gun Edge's Smart Mask. I've inverted the mask for us to cover the majority of my model, and then added a fill layer with Scratch's Grunge, while setting its blending options to Subtract. I've also modified my main material by adding a different paint layer, applying a Smart Mask to it, and also applying a Blur Slope filter, with its intensity divider set to 10. This filter gives our paint layer a somewhat hand-painted cartoony look. I've also changed projection methods of my layers to triplanar. This setting helps to hide most visible UV seams. Finally, I've applied two different versions of Fred Taylor's material. There isn't much to tell about it. Lights were made from a default plastic dusty smart material that received an extra emissive channel. Make sure to paint them properly before adding emission, so that their textures stay in place should you decide to disable emission. Also, I've added dark emission channels to dust and dirt. The way they started blocking light coming from the plastic itself. Finally, I created a fixed paint layer, set all of its blending options to pass through, and used the Clone Stamp tool to conceal remaining visible UV seams. I've cut out this part of the video because it took me a lot of time. Make sure to rotate your environment and alter your lighting settings now and then to see how your model performs in different environments. The rivets were created by duplicating the main material, altering its base color slightly, increasing its height, masking it, and unmasking it by using the Follow Along Path tool. I've lowered its brush size and increased both its spacing and its hardness. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day!